Oh, hey, I didn't notice you, even though I set up the entire camera myself and walked around it to sit here and turned it on. Anyway, hi, I'm Laura, and this is Tropes Trilogy, and today I'll be talking about the difference between self-insert and self-exploration. Woo! So before I can compare these two different methods, I have to define them each. Because while generally a self-insert is considered bad writing, because it usually is, I personally think self-exploration is great and should be talked about more. So a self-insert is when your character is essentially you. It's not that they're exactly like you personality-wise and appearance-wise, but they're written as a vessel for your own wish fulfillment. And they tend to overlap with a Mary Sue. Because the issue is not that someone like you wouldn't be a good complex protagonist, because we're all real complex people here. But it's that when you write a self-insert, whether intentionally or unintentionally, you write an idealized version of yourself who gets what they want, because the point of wish fulfillment is to give you all that you want. So you take away your flaws, which is what makes everyone interesting, and your struggle by giving you what you want. And this also tends to lead to self-inserts lacking character arcs or development because they're perfect from the beginning. Generally, I've seen self-inserts go one of two ways. One, the character is actually flawless to the point that they're boring. Or two, the author does actually write a realistic version of themselves with flaws. However, the author doesn't realize that the flaws are actually flaws, which results in an unlikable character getting away with bad behavior. And yes, I've read both of these in published books. Personally, I find that the boring, perfect character is less interesting as a character in themselves, but the character that has the flaws and gets away with them is more frustrating because it seems like the author is just rewarding them for the sake of being the protagonist, and I end up rooting for other characters because the main character is getting away with other things. So I'll root for an antagonist even if they aren't a good person, just for the sake of wanting something to happen to the protagonist and them get their comeuppance. I will say two tells about how the character is described that tend to overlap with a self-insert or Mary Sue is when the protagonist looks like the author or is described as insanely good-looking, or is an insanely good-looking version of the author. And though personally I am not into perfect-looking characters, I find it to be annoying usually because the author never shuts up about how good-looking the character is, and I honestly don't care. This doesn't make a character a self-insert. Generally, I don't think an author should immediately be accused of writing a self-insert because their protagonist has similar features to them. Maybe they just haven't seen a character with specific features and they wanted to write that. I know personally, I don't think I can think of any female protagonist or male protagonist really that I've read with brown hair and blue eyes. It's usually blue eyes and blonde hair, or brown hair and brown eyes or green eyes. It's just, there's not really much of that combination. The only one I can think of that's a cheat of that is Piper from Percy Jackson, but she has blue, green, and brown eyes that magically change between them. And I'm not really into that. I'm not into magic changing eyes. I feel like that's the author being like, my character's special. Again, I don't think the character's like that. I think Piper's actually well written, which is an example of why what the character looks like doesn't explain how they will actually be. But generally, if a character's insanely good looking or looks like the author, there is a reason to be more suspicious. So to give some examples, Piper, who is on the front of this cover, is an insanely good looking character. However, plot-wise, she is the daughter of Aphrodite, so it makes sense. And her character is very explicitly given flaws, so she is not a self-insert or Mary Sue. Whereas another example of a book where the character has a trait similar to the author is Alethea by Megan Tennant, where Megan actually said in one of her videos that yes, she gave the protagonist 736 in this book the same dark red hair color that she has. However, 736 is very explicitly given flaws. Characters upset at her for valid reasons, and she gets called out a lot. So again, these are two examples of books where good-looking character that looks similar to the author, but they're very clearly not self-inserts or Mary Sue's. They're flawed, complex characters. However, I will say if you're an author and you write a character that has your features or is insanely good looking, people will more likely accuse your character of being a self-insert, which is why I think with those characters it is very important to make sure you emphasize their flaws. But at the end of the day, your character's looks don't matter. So if your character's looks don't really matter, what are the real tells of a character being a self-insert or a Mary Sue? Also, I will say these definitions I'm giving lean more towards Mary Sue than to self-insert. Any reader can say your story has a Mary or Gary Stu, whereas a self-insert is something more internal with the author. And I will say if you have a sort of author platform, specifically on YouTube, you will probably be more likely accused of writing self-inserts because the audience will know you better and they can see how the character is like you. For example of a character that I think is very much like a Mary Sue, Selena Sardathian, specifically in this book, which is the latest one I've read, becomes a Mary Sue. In the earlier books, she is kind of one, but I feel like she's more of a character with some flaws, just too focused on being relatable. But in this book, she doesn't make mistakes. She outsmarts the villain, and most of the tension in the book is us just not knowing her secret plan as opposed to her actually struggling. So in Queen of Shadows, I would say that Selena is a Mary Sue. And I would give her as an example of one of the overpowered ones who does have flaws and is mean to characters, but it's excused and the author just brushes it off. And again, I will say that if you have a platform, people will be able to tell if characters have similarities to you. I mean, in my review for Again But Better, I do say the character feels like a self-insert, just an unaware one, which I still think that the character came across like that. Number 1, your protagonist is the best at everything, or at least a lot of things, and they gain skills at specific things extremely fast. For example of this, I would say Evelyn Kingston from Eve the Awakening. In this book is explicitly said to be the most powerful chimera in the world, which makes her the best of the best. And another issue I have is with the improvement of fighting in this book. The first fight scene, 4 characters take like 5 minutes to defeat one alien. It's really intense and awesome. But by the third fight, all of them are fighting off over 50 aliens like nothing. And that extreme increase in their ability to fight makes the story less intense, but also gives the protagonist a bit of a overpowered Mary Sue aspect. Number 2, the moral compass of side characters can be easily determined by whether or not they like your protagonist or your protagonist likes them. And usually these protagonists will instantly judge characters and always be right. Honestly, it's really interesting seeing good guys butt heads, so cutting this out and making your protagonist the beacon of goodness makes your story less interesting and makes it a very black and white conflict. And in real life, good people can disagree, so if anything, it's more realistic that all the good guys don't just love your protagonist. And finally, number 3, your protagonist lacks any genuine character flaws. The reason I specify genuine is because there are sort of fake character flaws. Fake character flaws tend to be either one of 2 things. The first is that they tend to be generally positive things that the author pretends as a flaw. So this is when your character's flaw is that they're too kind or too selfless, and even though I don't think looks can determine whether a character is a Mary Sue or not, if their flaw is that they're too good looking, that's not a real flaw. Now, I will say you can make being too kind or too selfless a genuine character flaw. However, this has to be deliberate. And if you're going to do it, you should probably ask yourself if you're doing it because you're afraid a different flaw would make your character less likable, or if it's because you're genuinely interested in the concept of kindness and selflessness being used as flaws. I find that fake character flaws are very common in fiction for children, and to give 2 examples which are unpopular opinions, I do think to a certain extent Percy Jackson by Rick Riordan has a bit of these aspects. Now, he does make mistakes, but when it comes to action scenes, he does win very easily. And also, in this book, they actually make a point of saying his fatal flaw because all of the demigods have them. And his is that he cares about his friends too much and won't abandon them and will try to save them. That's not a really good character flaw, if a character flaw at all. Now, I do think Percy Jackson has some flaws, and I actually talked about him as an example in my character arc video, so it's not that I think he's a badly written character, but his fatal flaw is a cop-out flaw. And I think Annabeth is actually a better example because her fatal flaw is pride, which is an actual flaw. Because if you're doing it because you want to explore something, that's fine, but if you're doing it because you're afraid people won't like your protagonist, that's just not a good reason. And also, generally, if you give your character this flaw, they probably should have more than one flaw if that's the case. And then the second thing that makes a character flaw fake is when it has no actual consequences for the character in the book. The most common one I see for a protagonist is that they're judgmental and kind of a jerk to people when they judge them. However, it's not a real character flaw if their judgments are always correct. If that's the case, then your protagonist just knows everything for no particular reason. A well-written protagonist should face consequences for their actions and for their flaw, and if they never make a wrong judgment and it doesn't have actual consequences that they must work through that affect the plot, then it's not a real flaw. And again, quick note, it's better to give your protagonist multiple flaws because real people have multiple flaws and it adds to the complexity of your character. Most authors give their protagonist multiple attributes, so multiple flaws make sense. Though you can give your characters physical things that are considered flaws, a Mary Sue with acne is still a Mary Sue. And the fourth trait of Mary Sues that self-inserts tend to also have is that the protagonist is the biggest victim of all of victimhood. They're an orphan, they're poor, people are mean to them for no reason, but they're still a good person and have no issues despite this. They're pretty much as much of an underdog you could be while also being the most amazing person at everything. So it's not like they have any actual flaws that come from with themselves, or they're just not very good at fighting but they're forced into these situations. No, they can fight and they can like blow up things with their mind, but their parents were mean to them or died and they were raised by mean people. So it kind of has to do with making the character the biggest victim ever to try to gain sympathy points instead of actually giving them struggles by not making them good enough to beat everything right away. So that is a self-insert / Mary Sue. What is self-exploration? So a lot of times I notice self-inserts or Mary Sues are accidents. The authors aren't specifically being like, yes, I'm going to write a perfect version of myself in this book. That sounds like a great idea. No, that is not what happens. However, a self-exploration is purposeful. It's giving characters some of your traits, preferably flaws that you know are flaws, and exploring what they mean within the context of your story. What they say about your character, how you can overcome them. This can also apply to giving a character a similar struggle to you because you've lived through it, so of course you can relate it to it and understand how it affects you emotionally. A self-exploration requires self-awareness and should be a purposeful decision. If you are a naturally selfish person and you acknowledge this and you want to get through this, you can write a protagonist who is naturally selfish and explore the ways this affects them and how they can change. And I think it can make your character struggle to overcome their flaws more powerful in certain cases. If you worked hard to achieve something before only to still fail, then write that struggle. Readers might relate to it if you do too. Also, one important thing to specify about self-exploration is that the character is not entirely like you and everything they do isn't based on your own experience. Self-exploration is when you put pieces of yourself or your experiences into the character and their journey. They should still have aspects of them that separate them from you. Self-exploration requires vulnerability, but it can create some of the most genuine stories. Though I will say writing about struggles you don't have is great and creates empathy for the author by having to put their self in someone else's shoes, that also doesn't devalue writing about your own struggles and flaws. Because having read a lot, I do think authors tend to gravitate gravitate towards certain character flaws and struggles. This character's struggle is that they're poor and an orphan. This one's flaw is that they're naive, or they're too kind, or too trusting, or that they're socially awkward and a nerd. And there's nothing bad about writing these stories because every story should be told. I also think some of the more nuanced struggles people go through are interesting, and even if your flaw or struggle is something commonly written about, there's something very visceral about writing something you've experienced. In short, a lot of people are talking about how they really like own voices, and I think own voices is great, and I would describe self-exploration as sort of similar to that when it's writing about something you've personally experienced, but it's more of an internal level. It's your own struggles that you've gone through emotionally, or your own flaws that you acknowledge about yourself, or maybe even some of your passions or attributes. Those are things that aren't necessarily based on a label, but based on you as an individual. And obviously, own voices is still should be written about individuals. And I think by exploring how a real struggle you went through hurt you or caused you to hurt others, and how you struggled through it to either overcome or succumb to it, can create a powerful story. It makes it more of a emotional process to write it and explore it, and can sometimes make it more tangible to people who've run through it. Now, again, I don't think you have to write your own flaws or struggles. I think it's great to write about others because it builds empathy within yourself and stretches your creativity, but I don't think we should discount writing pieces of ourselves in a story if it's done in a self-aware way. And that's the thing. Self-exploration is not for everyone. There has to be a certain degree of self-awareness and introspectiveness to successfully write it and publish it. However, if you have that, I encourage you to give it a shot. And sometimes it might actually help you get through your struggles by showing you the hard choices you have to make in a way where you can write through it and actually explore the consequences and figure out what you want to do. I think writing can be very cathartic and therapeutic, and I don't think that's always a bad thing. And though I do think that you shouldn't just write your therapy book and then publish it without thinking it through or looking at it and making sure that readers don't read it and be like, oh, this is a self-insert, they just wrote themselves in it. You don't want it to be obvious, but I also think it isn't inherently bad, and I think there's a lot of talk about how don't give your characters your character traits, don't give them your passions, don't let them look like you, they can never have anything in common with you because that's bad. I think that's a bit of a overreaction to the concept of self-insert and Mary Sue. But that's just some food for thought. It isn't really a rule. I think putting pieces of yourself into your characters can be a powerful thing because at the end of the day, only you will ever write your book. So if you put your personal experiences, feelings, and struggles into your characters, that's something that no one else can write because there's only one you. Writing your story based on tropes you looked up online is great. I love tropes, but there has to be a certain amount of you put into how you do every trope. Also, I got a Cinderella shirt to go with my Cinderella mirror. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please tell me all your thoughts down below, and I'll see you later.